everyone, and welcome to another edition of the vAuto podcast. I'm excited for this episode. It's a follow-up to an episode we just released here in May of 2021. That episode featured a project involving Northwood University students who examined inventory and process and practices at dealer Mark Bush's Bush Auto Place store in Wilmington, Ohio. This episode is going to dive even deeper into the specific recommendations that the students offered for Mark and his dealership. And to discuss all of those, we have dealer Mark Bush, Jennifer Patten, an instructor at Northwood University, and Patrick Janes, who heads up Stockwave's business development efforts for vAuto and also serves as an adjunct instructor at Northwood. Welcome, everyone, to the podcast today.
Thank you.
Now, as we get started, Mark, if you would, just for our listeners, give us a little bit of background on your store in Ohio. I do know that from looking at your webpage, you're a second-generation dealer, so maybe tell us how you got into business and what prompted you to take over the store.
Sure. We moved from Columbus down here in 1970. I was 5 at the time, but my father bought into a Chevy Buick store here in Wilmington, and I graduated from Northwood in 1987 and came back and started running that store. And in 1990, I bought out the local Pontiac Cadillac GMC store and kind of put it all together, and built this current dealership in '94. Of course, we've lost Pontiac and Oldsmobile, but we've got what's left of GM here. So it's, Northwood was great. After Northwood, I went to NADA's Dealer Academy and graduated from there in '88, and I've been running the company and owning it since 1990.
And where would you put your current, I know this is a little bit of a weird year to talk about volume, but just for our listeners, new and used volume average on a monthly basis there?
We're averaging this year about 90 units a month, new and used.
Okay.
We're at 40 new and 50 used. Even during the pandemic, I did some major management changes. I shouldn't say changes. I had a GM that was here for 43 years and retired in December of 19, and I brought in a new management team, and they have grown, and they're the reason the success we've had for the last 2 years.
Mark, I got a quick question for you. You said that 40 new and 50 used. Historically, is that typical? Because I've heard from a lot of dealers that ratio has changed over the last year or better.
Well, yeah, 2 years ago, we've probably been selling 3 used to 1 new.
Okay.
So we've really grown the new, and we've increased the used too. But yeah, that ratio is a lot different 2 years ago.
Yeah. Good. Well, let's dive into the meat of our conversation here today. And Jennifer, perhaps you and Patrick could give us a quick overview of the purpose and scope of the student project and how it fits in to the dealership management curriculum there at Northwood.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thank you. So Northwood University has a couple different paths that you can go on: the aftermarket path, the corporate path, and the retail path. And so Mark's son, Joey, and his best friend, Brady, attend Northwood University. And so within our classes, we try and do as much experiential learning as we can. And so I presented the students an opportunity to take on a project in which we would deep dive into a dealership's inventory and take a look at really what it takes to efficiently run the days to market. And that was really what our project was based upon. And we had a couple students in variable op volunteer to do that. And then we had a couple students in the general management class volunteer to do that, and they collaborated. So this wasn't necessarily a course requirement. It was something that students, which we have quite a bit of students with tremendous leadership and initiatives. And so they'll volunteer to take these on. And we do a lot of things with NADA and auto shows around the country, and tons of different opportunities that students get involved in outside of Northwood. And so this was one that they volunteered to do and learn more about days to market. And so Mark was kind enough to let us use his dealership and give us access to his back-end vAuto, in which we had the great opportunity to meet with his performance manager, Claude, and Claude gave us a tutorial of what best practices would be, so the students got to experience, if they were a dealer, how they would be advised. And we all know that, you know, with underneath the Cox umbrella, there's tremendous amounts of access to information to be able to help us make better decisions. This was an opportunity for them to not only know about it, but actually use it, to have an experience of diving into it, but then also getting the learning opportunity from experts such as vAuto and Mark. But then also the students have their own creative ideas. They look at things different with a fresh set of eyes. And so from their perspective, they were actually able to provide value back on some of those thoughts and directive. And as an instructor, I kind of guide that. Just like you, managing a podcast, guide the conversation. I do a lot of that with the students, where we have a lot of industry experts that will come in, such as Patrick, and teach a class, and then we follow up with discussion and application. And so that's kind of how this project started, was an opportunity to really understand some of the things that we were being shown from Patrick's instruction.
Interesting.
Jennifer, I'll add to that on the, you know, Lance, curriculum wise, we learned after the first year. I've been teaching up there for 3 years now, and after the first year, we started seeing the value in that kind of hands-on application. So we transformed into, we would do a lecture, and then a couple days later, they would actually have a lab where they would get into the vAuto software, and, you know, we teach them about metrics and how to appraise a car and how to price a car, but then they would actually go into the software and get to do that. So I think that's just another step. And now you take the step here where they're actually now going into a dealership and, you know, trying to X-ray a store, as we call it in performance management world, and then try to find real problems. But, you know, being a vAuto store, they're familiar with the software and can go in and look at the cars and the metrics and see what might be the issue with the vehicle from the vAuto side of the fence.
So Mark, before we kind of talk about specific recommendations, what was the experience like? Were you making yourself available? Did the students come to your store, or was it more, you know, arm's length where they had the back end access and could kind of do their assessment that way?
Well, a couple things. Both Joey and Brady worked for me last summer.
Okay.
And then I just got Jennifer with my performance manager and got her credentials to get into vAuto, and she met with Claude. And I think students met with Claude. Well, I met with all of them at one time, but I was kind of hands off on it. Claude took them through it, and the kids could get in the system and look at everything.
So they weren't necessarily inspecting cars; they were just looking at what the cars were doing online and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, now one of the things I know from the students' report, they looked at the way you merchandised your cars, and it looks like you received a grade of an A-, which if you think about like how I did in high school, I'd take that any day of the week. But what was your assessment of that grade? What was your reaction?
My general sales manager was very excited. That was better than he expected. But
Okay.
yeah, that was I was proud of that. But I got 3 people that really worked hard, from my general sales manager, my used car manager, and my sales coordinator. That all 3 of them work as a team and try to make sure we're covering most of the bases.
And what would be an example in terms of, like, do you have targets for number of photos and that sort of thing that they strive to achieve?
Yes, we try to get a minimum of 27 photos. The sales coordinator, she'll work with the vendors, knowing what needs, you know, dentless paint repair, what needs touch-up paint and such. And so she'll coordinate. And, you know, you want to have that car detailed before the guy comes in to do that work. So she's very good at getting that set up. And knowing that we're under a clock to get all this done. So between those 3 managers, they work well together to make sure that happens.
And I guess going back to a point Jennifer made on days to sale or days to get it ready, what's the target and what's the actual performance there at your store?
We're back to 5 days. When we started this project, we're more like 11 days.
Okay.
And that's when I was short on the technicians and we were getting a backlog. We've now cleaned that up, but 5 days is the goal from
Okay.
safety detailed picture.
Great, great. Now, one of the student recommendations, Mark, was that they thought your vehicles should show up a little higher as they were looking for your cars and similar cars on sites like Auto Traders, and that your reviews from customers could use a little refreshing. So I guess I'm curious, what have you done with respect to those recommendations specifically, and any results maybe that you've seen from them?
Let me start with the reviews. We launched a new website about 6 months ago, and then because of that, found out we were having an issue with links. And that's why that was the issue with reviews. So that should be getting cleaned up here. It's better now. It'll continue to get better. But thank God that came up, because I had no idea the old website link was gone, so it was all screwed up. But on the spotlights, the only way to get more spotlights is to spend more money. And as we're sitting here turning the inventory 15 times, 13 times, and 27-day supply, it's tough to throw more advertising dollars. But as we all know, this market's going to soften, and when it does, I would look at increasing that spend. But it just doesn't make sense right now to throw more dollars out there with the way things are going.
To maybe let me play that back, Mark. So I guess in a more normal scenario, you might give that more weight, but it's not like there's a problem with demand and cars moving quickly.
New or used. And it's tough to increase spend when you're selling before they get off the truck.
Yeah, that is true. Another point, as we touched on a moment ago, is that the students examined how you're moving your cars through service. And I think you mentioned you've seen some dramatic improvement there from 11 days down to 5. But I understand part of that is related to a sales coordinator position. So could you tell me a little bit about that position? And I believe that actually predated this student project and may have helped with some of the results that you were able to see here.
Yeah, we created that position probably 6 or 7 years ago.
Okay.
And she's in charge, checking in inventory, whether new or used. The phone operator also handles that, but especially all the used. She does the deal jacket. She makes sure they get through service. She works with the vendors. And she gets the pictures. She gets them through detail, and then she gets everything pictured. It's been a big help.
So she coordinates with the vendors then too, as far as when the work went. Okay.
Correct. She coordinates with service and all the vendors and the detail shop. She's the one go-to person, and she's responsible for getting all that through.
Okay. Now, you mentioned that you had a backlog before, and you might have hired some techs. Tell me a little bit about what that was like, and where you found the techs too.
We hired. I've been for a year. I've been trying to hire 2,
Okay.
and it took a long time to find the right ones. I had mentioned one of them was one of my parts guys who was a technician before, decided he wanted to get back in the shop, and so he's really helped us get our used cars up and running. And the other guy was just a local technician we hired. But I've spent most of the pandemic trying to hire people, and it was very tough.
Was that because of a lack of talent, or maybe some of the talent was there, but maybe there was some hesitation to go back to a physical workplace?
I think a little bit of both. I think we're, not just with technicians. I've been trying to hire people for my BDC department, and I feel like we're competing with the federal government and the state government trying to hire people. With the additional monies that are out there, tough for a guy to say, hey, for the same dollar, I can sit at home. So that's just my opinion. But,
sure.
It's tough to hire people.
Yep. Now the students made this gets to throughput of cars in service, and they made a suggestion, and I realize that maybe this pain point has dissipated of late to some degree, but I was kind of intrigued by this. They suggested that you prorate the internal labor rate so that if a car takes longer than it should, the service department gets paid less money, if they miss a goal. But I also understand that maybe there's a safe harbor of sorts where if they tell you that, or there's sort of advance notice that there's a problem, that maybe that lower rate for their work doesn't get activated. So 2 points there. Have you introduced that at your store? And secondarily, if so, what are your thoughts about that practice?
We have not introduced it yet. I like the thought.
Okay.
And position I was in 4 or 5 months ago, I'd have done it in a heartbeat. We all know that money motivates people, and loss of money may motivate people also. When we get back to that point where there's a backlog, we'll definitely look at implementing that. I like the idea. We do it. We do it in other aspects of the business. F&I, if contracts over 10 days old, he gets penalized. So, you don't want to tie your cash up, and it's a motivation to get people doing their job.
Mm-hmm. Now, there was another. This ties back to something we talked about a second ago, but the students suggested a checklist that the sales coordinator can use. And I'm curious if that checklist is now part of your process there as well. And maybe for the sake of folks listening and watching, what's on the checklist?
Yeah, Jennifer did just send me their checklist. And it's very similar to what our sales coordinator uses.
Okay.
She's detailed, but she did tweak a little bit. I haven't seen the finished product, but I did share that with her. And I think she did tweak hers a little bit on her checklist. It was very good.
Excellent. Now, there was another point the students made, and again, I realize that your angst and anguish over cars not getting through the shop isn't quite as heavy as it was a little while ago, but suggested that when that occurs, particularly in detailing cars, that maybe you should outsource that work. And I guess I'm curious if that's something you've also taken to heart and explored.
Over the years, there's been a time or two that we have done that. There's also been a time or two where I'll get college kids or high school kids to come in and try to help. Mm-hmm. It's a little tough when you're making 70% gross margin on that stuff to send it down the street.
Sure.
To do, but as a last resort, if we're in a bind, I would. And I have done it before, but it's got to be way behind to spend, lose 70% to ship it out somewhere. So.
Understood. Jennifer, before we got started and we were chatting off camera, you mentioned that in your consulting work that you're seeing, I guess, signs of dealers with some difficulty moving cars, getting cars through service and ready. What are the pain points that you're seeing as you work with the dealers that you consult with?
Well, the goal always is days to market, right? So the shorter we can make the days to market, the better off we're going to be at flipping that inventory and getting the most amount of gross that we possibly can. The struggle is when you purchase so much inventory at once, your pipeline isn't set up to support that much inventory. So when you PDI a car, you have a skilled technician that's at a certain level, but that technician might not be at the same level that you need to support the used car reconditioning process. And so the recruitment of talent into the service department is definitely probably the #1 issue I'm seeing amongst most dealerships. And how we're overcoming that is we're doing like quick wash and vacs or pre-detail before it gets to service, so at least the merchandising can take place. Partial photos on vehicles in which we can't even get the detailing done, so at least there's a representation of it. But then the other issue that you run into also with pipeline is the reconditioning process. If you do it in-house and you have 2 people and they do X amount per day and you double that business, you've doubled the days to market. So it's either going with plan B and outsourcing it to speed it up, or it's hiring more people or longer hours, greater shift. But really it's becoming a backlog. And I can probably tell you, I'd probably say 70% of the dealers on their no photo report list right now are considerably higher. Mark's very fortunate right now, I think, to be in the situation that he was able to recruit that talent. The other thing I really think that came about out of this project was Mark's leadership. And I mentioned that before in the last podcast, but the person at the top making the decision ultimately determines the speed and the success of the ship. And so dealership, and Mark's really good at that. He's really good at inspecting what you expect and the processes that he put in place to make sure his managers knew what they needed to do every 2 weeks, I think was a big part of him being in front of it. And so sometimes people are reactionary in this business. They look at a big report and they go, but he was more proactive. And he looked at it and saw a number, go, okay, team, what do we have to do? Where's our backlog? And he identified that. And like he said, he was actually recruiting ahead of time, so he didn't get in that same situation. And I think there's a portion of our dealerships that are really good at being proactive, but unfortunately we all know in retail we get busy, and we're really busy in the used car department right now, and unless you have a position like Mark does, where he has a dedicated admin person that handles the administrative tasks on a daily basis and can focus without the interruptions that typically a sales manager would have, you become less effective. So I think for me, the big takeaway, and the big takeaway maybe for your listeners, would be have a sales coordinator, a person that handles all the administrative tasks, getting the ROs written, getting the keys, getting the titles, getting the deals booked, all of that stuff that frankly, a used car manager per hour can produce much higher, and you can delegate some of that out and get it done probably more efficiently and effectively because you get somebody who has a skill set, right, to do the administrative aspect of it. So Mark was smart, again, great leadership, to see that and implement that process ahead of time. So if I were to recommend advice, I would probably say make sure you've got somebody managing the process. So if you have to put photos, right, in front of detailer service, you have a way to coordinate it and a way to communicate with your outside vendors. So going back to that checklist, the checklist also has a way to communicate that says, yep, this has a stone chip in it. So we know that when the stone chip repair guy comes in, this is the car he needs to touch or she needs to touch. Dentless dent removal, any of those kind of alloy wheels, any of those outside services you would touch with, the checklist is a great way to track it. But again, it's very difficult when you're managing a sales team to be effective on a regular basis at the admin.
That squares up with an experience. I spoke with a dealer in Virginia last week, and he now has an assistant. I think it was a lot porter, lot tech guy that is now doing just that sales coordinator position to free him up. But I'm just kind of curious for the group's take, and maybe Mark, you could sound off on this first. But that dealer is selling cars to customers before they're reconditioned and signing the deal and saying, we'll get it done, come back in a week to take delivery. How does that strike you, that sort of transaction dynamic?
We have done it before.
Okay.
We have done it. 90% of the time we know what the car needs, and then we'll add to it on the recon VO. We're going to post $1,000 to the deal, but it's especially during the pandemic that has happened.
Okay.
I'd say probably 15-20% of the time when used cars, not now but prior, were reconned after the sale.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Lance, I want to pick up on something Jennifer said, which this was a tried and true, best practice of mine when I was a performance manager, but I made a lot of friends with this. She talked about that partial photos. And I have seen literally, I'm not talking about days to market, but turns increase by 2 and 3-fold when they just take that quick snapshot of the vehicle. We have tons of research, obviously, with our relationship with Auto Trader about how a real photo, a live photo, actually convinces the customer that you have the car. They're not into stock photos, and they're not into coming soon and all that. But just getting, even if it's not a great photo, right? It's from the appraisal process, getting a photo up and saying just arrived, that now you've got a customer who says, I was going to drive 2 markets over because we're in a very low supply market right now, and my local dealer has this car right now. Now, apparently, they just have 1 photo. Obviously, they got to get it cleaned up, but I want to be the first one to be able to see that car once it's ready, because I've been shopping for that thing for my 12 to 18 hours worth of work that I've done on the internet, and they've got it. And I think it's a very powerful recommendation. And many folks I talk to would be like, oh, yeah, but then we'll have problems because we'll have customers wanting to see cars before they're ready. And I'm like, really? Is that a problem? I would rather have a captive audience, and I'd rather fight through that part than to not let them know I had the car and have them drive somewhere else and buy a competitor's cars, in my opinion. So that's a great point I picked up with Jennifer. And it sounds like Mark's done some of that with that in the recon later.
We at least take it to the car wash and do 5 pictures. Get 5 pictures, and they're all outside, but around, unless the inside's clean, there'll be a few. We do that.
Mm-hmm. Now, Patrick, you had a question which I thought was a good closer for our episode segment. Could you offer that, please?
So we talked, as I looked at some of the questions about today, we've talked a lot about merchandising and speed to market and all that. I got to ask you, Mark, set that aside now. What would be the other pain point right now in your operation? No merchandising, keep that out, that you would say would be the next project. If you said, okay, I got a new group of, Jennifer's got a new group of students coming in, and I want to throw something at them and let them tackle. I'm just curious of what that would be in today's market with things being a little crazy.
The one thing we've struggled with is getting processes set up for service to sales, handoff, or however you want to call it. We've been buying cars here and there through service, but we don't have a true and tried process. And we've been talking about it for 6 months, and we really got nothing done on it. That would be an area of great importance. To give you an idea, I've got a son that's in school out in Oklahoma, and every time he takes his Chevy Impala in to get service, he gets an offer for the car. Every time he goes in for an oil change, every time. And and I know with vAuto, we've got the service appointments in there. It's not a hard job to do. We just haven't figured out the process yet.
Great. I'm adding that to my lectures, Jennifer. I got a couple of tips on that. We'll get it down through the students, and they'll be ready for the next project.
Hey, project accepted, Mark. Let's do it.
Sounds good.
Well, one thing I have heard from talking to dealers about this specific issue is it's a little bit like the sales coordinator, where somebody's got to be in charge, and it can't be an adjunct to a raft of other responsibilities. I've also heard that the soft touch there it also can be effective, meaning it's just you just go ahead and appraise the car, and then just put the appraisal in the fake check offer in front of them, and there's enough that bite for some that that it's worthwhile to do that.
Sure.
Well, that brings us to a close of this episode. I want to thank you all. Mark, thank you for taking the time to do the project, number one, and then join us for 2 podcasts and share your perspective. Appreciate that.
I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
Good. And Jennifer, thank you as always.
Thank you, Lance. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Mark.
Yes, and thank you, Patrick. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for joining us for this episode of the vAuto podcast. Until next time, stay well.